Maybe if you're trying to convince the general public that these boys are innocent, don't quote a mob movie in which they then beat up a bunch of bikers at a bar.
Because if you don't do that, once you're in court, now you just can't leave.
And it seems quite obvious to me that this lawyer, instead of, presenting evidence that would help exonerate them in the public eye, like showing the actual security cam footage of when they came home or the text messages with Katie. No. Instead, we're going to keep it focused on race, which you can see by this clip.
People are pushing the narrative of, oh, this is a race thing. Well, obviously it's not. I mean, this is like a brother to us. I mean, Nolan's no different than anyone else in our group. I think it's so criminal that they took something so anti-racist and flipped it into something super racist. Like they took, this is the definition of anti-racism. I mean, that we did not look at Nolan any different than I looked at him, or even you.
Okay, first off, that even you was wild. It's quite clear from that sentence that Jax has never had an actual conversation about racism in his entire life. I was friends with a black person. That's the most anti-racist anybody's ever been. This situation was the most unracist thing that's ever existed. It's the media. They're the ones making this racist. No, you don't understand what that means. It means your story doesn't hold water, and when people called you out on it and called out the investigation on not even investigating, that is systematic racism. It's very, very clear to me that the lawyer is the one telling them to keep the focus on race. Because you can see the lawyer and the gears in his head turning and nodding and agreeing along with all of the racial stuff. And you can see him kind of being like, yeah, okay, that's what I'm saying, yeah. So it's very clear that that was one of the bullet points that the lawyer told them to hit home over. And another one was the Coast Guard. Why would I call the Coast Guard if I knew he was dead? I called the Coast Guard right away. First off, you didn't. You waited till 11 o'clock. Second, it's not like the Coast Guard searched for him that night. Warren clung to that like it was a safety raft.
I think from the beginning, I'm glad that I called the Coast Guard. It would have been completely different. I'm glad I called the Coast Guard.
It's like, I'm sorry, Warren, but it's actually way more suspicious that you called the Coast Guard, because first, you didn't want to call the Coast Guard when you guys were sinking, and then for some reason, you assumed that Nolan was still out on the island at 11 o'clock at night. Why wouldn't you assume that he came back with the person he was supposed to come back with, and something happened to him in transit? Because no reasonable person would think that he was still out on the island, in my opinion. Because in your own words, Warren, you said you didn't talk to Katie till the next day. And then speaking of the island, the lawyer tries to say that by them going to the island and looking around, that it absolutely exonerates them and that the narrative couldn't be this, and ends it with a wild statement, mind you.
People who have been sucking up way more oxygen than they're entitled to have not been to the island. I'm willing to bet that a lot of the hustlers and profiteers and liars have not been to that island, and you have to go to that island. And being at the island today was revelatory. It was really illuminating. It's a very dynamic marine environment, first of all. But when you go to the island, you see instantly that what some people want to be true, what they wish to be true, they're trying to wish it to be true, they're trying to make it true through their lies. It's actually not possible. It is a very, very long and narrow barrier island. It's basically very low sand dunes. And the particular part of the island that we're dealing with, there are no trees. It's hardly any foliage, hardly any tree cover, hardly any plants, and it's wide open. And on July 4th, there were thousands of people there. There is no possible way that anybody could have committed a murder in broad daylight.
Murder? Who's saying anything about a murder? Most of us are under the assumption that an accident happened and they covered it up. All of this stuff that they keep trying to point to as evidence that they didn't do anything to him are not actually evidence. You know what is evidence? The security cam footage. Explain to us why the grandfather was the one who canceled the CETO. How about that? And what I see is just a complete lack of responsibility with these boys, because listen to this phrasing.
I wish we would have never, I think about this every day, I wish we would have never went out on the 4th of July, because I know this wouldn't have happened.
You see, instead of saying, I should have made sure my friend got home safely, they said, I wish we had never gone out. And I have to admit, my little antennas buzzed a little when it sounded like he was going to say, I knew this was going to happen, right? That seems like what he was going to say. It wasn't, maybe we shouldn't have been underage drinking. They literally say, we did everything right.
I mean, there's not much I would change from my point of view and my friend's point of view. I think we did everything right, and I know we did nothing wrong.
Those are not the words of somebody who lost their brother, their best friend, a month ago. And I lost one of my closest friends in a suspicious way, I blamed myself, even though I hadn't even physically seen her in a couple years. And for those of you guys saying that Jax is the one that people should press, I fully disagree. He is the one that I think is the scariest out of these interviews. Watch the way he looks at Warren during this moment.
We live in a very tight-knit community, and for people to, push back and say these things when they know what Ocean Springs is like, it's really hard. And I mean, I don't think I haven't had many personal encounters, but I know being around the
Oh, he felt like he was saying something to Warren. Because let's not forget, it was his grandparents' house that they all got together at. It was his grandparents' house that they went back to and thus should have security cam footage from. And out of all of them, Jax is the one that is holding his body in a different way, who is more controlled, more level-headed. If these kids were truly looking to exonerate themselves, they would actually start addressing some of these questions, like, who was the fourth boat? Why were all of you huddled up out there together? Who drove the fucking Palm Beach? Boy, they really didn't want you to see this video because they made it ineligible immediately so you wouldn't see it. So let's go through a speed run of the information. We can now definitively say that this is Jax. We can also now definitively say that this is Morgan. He's wearing the same hat as well as the same bracelets. So where were they on the Triton? Now that we've got a much clearer video thanks to Officer Tatum, it's obvious that there is nobody in an orange swimsuit or a paisley swimsuit on this boat. We also barely see that there's somebody here in the red shorts. Now in this Katie Snapchat picture, I've been saying that there was somebody in the background here wearing red shorts. So I pumped up the exposure, and as you can see, it certainly looks like it. They seemingly have similar body types as well as similar hairlines. We also know that whoever was in the red shorts was also on the shoreline when the fight broke out. Now who was involved in that fight? Warren's brother Carter. Carter, who trains in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And by Warren's own admission, his brother put someone in an arm bar, and in case you don't know what that looks like, go ahead and look at that placement on the back of the head there. Spot look familiar? Given Carter's height, build, body type, this looks like it could be him. But one blurry, underexposed picture is not solid proof of anything, right? But we know Warren grabbed his younger brother and had him come over hang out with them on their boat as they were sinking or whatever. And it would be pretty bad for their case if this was Carter on the Triton and then on Katie's boat at 6 o'clock. But now my attention turns to this person who a lot of people think is Bart. But in his hand, he is holding a cell phone. So I thought, why would Bart jump from his boat to the other boat holding a cell phone when other people have cell phones in their hands while Wyatt is on the phone in the picture? So while I was trying to compare pictures of Bart to the person on the boat that I can't identify, I found this picture with him with a tattoo from about 2 years ago. And it wasn't until just today that I stopped looking at the tattoo and I started looking at his wrist. Because someone in the background of this picture has always stuck out to me because my instinct always was like, is that Bart? Bart seemingly has a pretty pronounced mullet as according to this picture, but this was definitely not on Bart's boat. I checked the seating and the covers, like it's not Bart's boat. Now I think you pretty much get where I'm going with this because then I remembered this bracelet. Pretty unique bracelet. Unique like the bracelet that Bart Jr. was wearing in that tattoo picture. And right here looks like it might be the tail end of a tattoo that wraps around the forearm, right in the same place that it would be on Bart. I've said for a while now that the story about them calling Bart that morning to go out on the boat never made sense, because what 21-year-old didn't already have plans for 4th of July? So then the question is, who is driving Bart's boat? Which brings me back to this guy who some people have thought looked like Bart. However, we do know that he was on Bart's boat handing out drinks to people in that 7-second clip we've seen. Same hair, same glasses, same hat. By the way, did y'all know that Bart has a younger brother? The family resemblance is very striking. I mean, the real difference is that he's a little bit shorter and has a squarer jaw. And does anybody want to guess what his younger brother's name is? Brooks. Now, I seem to remember, and I can't remember exactly the context, a certain somebody talking in an interview about his buddy Brooks. Thanks to this interview, I was able to finally, definitively put faces and names together, and then it hit me. We now know for sure that this is Jax. And now we know for sure that this is Morgan. He's literally wearing the same hat and the exact same armbands. So why aren't they on the Triton? A very unique blue swimsuit and an orange and yellow swimsuit. And now, thanks to Officer Tatum, we finally have a very clear video of them calling for the Cito. And, I don't see an orange swimsuit anywhere. I don't see a paisley swimsuit anywhere. So where are Jax and Morgan on this boat? We see what looks like Jax cuddling up to Katie on Bart's boat. So is this Bart over on their boat? Because here he was in that video handing out beers from his boat, and the sunglasses and the hat look the same. But what if it's not? Just stick with me, I'm gonna come back around to it. Because now I want to talk about Warren's 17-year-old brother, Carter. Carter, who we know got into a fight with someone and put someone in an armbar on the shore. Carter, who Warren said he told to come over and hang out with all of them and chill out. Carter, who practices Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Notice the hand placement. And if you're like me, I had to go look up and see what an armbar exactly is and how it is done. And oh, look at the placement of that arm. Yeah. Now this seems to me like it definitely could be Carter. The picture was just taken in December, so the haircut, the hairline, the body type, all of it. We also know that the person in the red shorts were on the shore when the fight happened. Now, y'all remember this picture, the Katie Snapchat pictures? Well, I brightened it up. All I did was just pump up the exposure, nothing else. And look in the background here. Oh, red shorts, just like I said. Lighter colored hair with a very familiar looking back of the neck. Now, of course, I'm not saying whether this is or isn't Carter. Boy, this wouldn't look good for anybody if this is Carter on Katie's boat at 6:02. But you know, one underexposed, blurry picture a smoking gun does not make. Unless somebody with a very unique haircut and a very distinct piece of jewelry happens to show up in one of these pictures. As Mullet Boy here has always bothered me because for some reason he's wearing what looks like jeans. Not saying they are jeans, just can't definitively prove one way or the other whether they are or not, or if it's just the design of the swim trunks. When I went back through some of the photos I had collected of Bart Jr. to try and figure out if this was him or not, I found this picture I had archived. Thanks to the tattoo in this picture, which is the reason I screen grabbed it, that's why I'm like, I don't think this is Bart, because I feel like I would see the tattoo there, but, and mind you, this picture is a couple of years old, but I just kind of wanted a timeline for this tattoo for identification purposes, and then I stopped getting distracted by the tattoo on his arm, and I looked at the bracelet on his wrist. Pretty unique set of bracelets, right? I mean, hopefully by now you've figured out where I'm going with this. Why, what a unique set of bracelets! So between the mullet and these bracelets, someone may come to the conclusion that Katie and Bart were on a boat together. Maybe not Bart's boat, because after all, they're claiming that this boat belonged to a Marty McGrath, who was the one who came and got people. But if that's Bart here, then who was driving Bart's boat? Did you guys know that Bart has a younger brother? Very similar looking, but I'll tell you what, very different jawlines, almost like the jawline of this person on the Triton. And guess what his brother's name is? Brooks. Now, where have I heard that before? Hasn't somebody talked about my buddy Brooks in previous interviews? I always said the whole "we called Bart that morning" story didn't make fucking sense.
There is a point in this interview where the emotion has to stop. Not because the emotion isn't real, not because the people involved aren't hurting, and not because the harassment being described isn't serious, but because once you strip away the anger, the accusations, the legal threats, and the certainty, you are left with a much harder question. What do we actually know? Because this interview contains something unusual. It contains arguments that sound convincing. Some of them are genuinely strong. Some of them deserve to be taken seriously. But there are also claims that move far beyond what the evidence, at least as presented here, can establish. And that distinction matters a lot. Because this case has now become a battle of competing narratives. One side says the young men on the boat are being unfairly blamed for something they didn't do. The other side of the public debate continues to question what happened to Nolan Wells and what the people around him may have known. And somewhere in the middle, the actual evidence is getting buried underneath the confidence of the people talking about it. So let's slow this down. Not emotionally, not politically, not for one side, for the evidence. Because if we're going to evaluate this interview fairly, We have to apply the same standard to these men that we've applied to everybody else connected to this case. No automatic guilt, no automatic innocence, no assumption that a confident person is necessarily telling the truth, and no assumption that someone who sounds sincere has therefore proved their claim. That is where this gets interesting. Because one of the strongest arguments made in the interview is also one of the easiest to misunderstand. The argument is simple. If these young men had deliberately killed Nolan on the boat and were then trying to cover it up, why would they call for help? Why would they bring a private towing company into the situation? Why would they contact the Coast Guard? Why would they voluntarily invite official attention to the exact circumstances surrounding the emergency? And if this was some elaborate murder and cover-up, why would they do it in circumstances where so many other people could potentially observe what they were doing? That is not a ridiculous argument. In fact, it's a legitimate piece of reasoning. Think about what the argument is actually saying. If someone has just committed a deliberate crime and understands that authorities could potentially discover what happened, you would normally expect that person to minimize attention. You would expect concealment. You would expect avoidance. You would expect behavior designed to keep investigators away. Instead, the account presented here involves a call for assistance. And, according to the interview, the Coast Guard was declined twice. That is important, because if the theory is that this was a carefully planned cover-up taking place on the boat, voluntarily bringing official attention toward the situation becomes difficult to explain. It doesn't make the theory impossible, but it creates a problem for it. And that distinction is critical. The evidence can make one explanation less convincing without proving another explanation beyond doubt. That is something people constantly get wrong in public investigations. They hear one theory weakened and immediately treat the alternative as proven. That's not how evidence works. The Coast Guard call is potentially powerful evidence against one very specific scenario. The scenario in which Nolan was deliberately killed on the boat, and the people responsible then staged an emergency to conceal what they had done. That theory has to explain why they would voluntarily summon additional scrutiny. It has to explain why they would call for help. It has to explain why they would involve people outside their group. And it has to explain why they would do all of that while supposedly trying to hide a murder. That is a genuine weakness. But now comes the part that is just as important. What if something else happened? What if Nolan's death wasn't the result of a premeditated murder on the boat? What if an accident happened later? What if there was a confrontation that escalated without anyone intending to cause a death? What if someone was in trouble and the people around them failed to respond appropriately? Those possibilities don't require the same elaborate cover-up theory. And that's why the Coast Guard argument cannot be stretched into a universal defense of everything that may have happened that day. It answers one question. It does not answer every question. And there is another important point. The specific theory being attacked in this part of the interview does not appear to be the same as the broader questions driving public scrutiny. That matters, because defeating an argument nobody in an official position has actually made is not the same thing as disproving the entire case. According to the discussion, investigators have not publicly alleged that these young men murdered Nolan on the boat and then staged the emergency call. So when that theory is dismantled, it doesn't necessarily resolve the larger mystery. It simply removes one possibility from the table, or at least makes that possibility harder to defend. And that's still useful, but we have to call it what it is. A narrow argument, not a complete explanation. Then there is the video footage. This is where another argument enters the conversation. The claim is that the footage from the boat during the emergency call shows people behaving normally, casually, going about ordinary activities, no obvious panic, no obvious reaction to a body, no visible behavior suggesting that something catastrophic had just occurred. On its face, that is worth examining. Video is different from somebody remembering how another person looked. Video gives us something concrete, something that can be reviewed, something that can be paused, something that can be examined frame by frame. If the footage really does show the entire relevant area of the boat during the relevant period, then the behavior of the people present becomes meaningful evidence. But there is a catch, and it is a very important one. We need to know what the footage actually captures. Does it show the entire boat? Does it cover the entire relevant period? Are there gaps? Are there areas outside the camera's view? And are we seeing the footage in its complete original context? Because a video can be real and still be incomplete. That distinction is often overlooked. People see a short clip and assume they are seeing the entire event. They're not. They're seeing what the camera captured. And if the interpretation of that footage is being presented by people whose own credibility is under scrutiny, then the public has to be careful not to accept the framing automatically. The footage should be examined independently. Not because the people describing it are necessarily lying, but because that's exactly how evidence is supposed to work. You don't decide what a piece of evidence means before you've established what the evidence actually contains. And that brings us to the Coast Guard argument again. Attorney Ed Pollack's reasoning here is arguably one of the more substantive legal arguments in the interview. His position is essentially that voluntarily contacting authorities can be inconsistent with consciousness of guilt. That's a legitimate concept. It isn't simply emotional advocacy. It is a recognizable form of behavioral reasoning. Someone who knows they have committed a serious crime may reasonably be expected to avoid additional scrutiny. So voluntarily bringing law enforcement into the situation can be relevant. But again, relevant does not mean conclusive. Human beings do irrational things. People panic. People make mistakes. People misunderstand situations. People call for help even when they have something to hide. And people sometimes tell the truth in one area while concealing something in another. So the call is evidence. It matters, but it is not a magic piece of evidence that tells us everything. And this is where the interview starts moving into more controversial territory, because now we get to the emergency audio. And this may be one of the most important distinctions in the entire discussion. The claim being made is that the audio was deliberately enhanced and that the enhancement effectively fabricated or manufactured Nolan's voice. It's a very serious claim, and serious claims require serious evidence. So what has actually been established? The forensic analysis discussed in this series identified technical problems with the version of the audio released publicly. The version attributed to TMZ reportedly ran longer than the original release. There were concerns involving the digital fingerprint. There were also redactions that did not align cleanly with the original file. Those are real reasons to ask questions about that particular processed version. Nobody should simply ignore them. But there is a huge difference between saying, this version has authentication problems, and saying, this recording was fabricated. Those are not the same statement. And this is exactly where the language being used in the interview becomes important. The forensic position described here was much narrower. The expert could not corroborate the disputed phrases. The file raised authentication concerns. The version could not be reliably authenticated against the original. Those are meaningful findings. But they do not automatically establish that someone manufactured Nolan's voice. They don't prove that the audio is fake. They establish uncertainty. And uncertainty is not fabrication. That distinction should matter to everyone. Because this series has criticized people on all sides for taking uncertain evidence and presenting it as settled fact. If one commentator says, "We know that's Nolan," and another commentator says, "We know that's completely fabricated," both statements can have the same fundamental problem. They may be claiming more certainty than the evidence allows. One side cannot demand forensic caution from its opponents, and then abandon that caution when the evidence happens to support its preferred narrative. The standard has to remain the same. That's the whole point. There is another legitimate concern buried inside the audio argument, and this one deserves attention. How was the transcript created? Was there a documented chain of custody? Was there a verified transcription process? Was the audio independently transcribed before viewers were shown a suggested transcript? Because once a person is told what they are supposed to hear, they may begin hearing it. That's not necessarily dishonesty. It's human psychology. Expectation changes perception. If you put words on the screen and then play ambiguous audio, the brain starts searching for those words. And suddenly, a sound that could have meant several things begins sounding like the phrase you were just shown. That's why ambiguous audio is dangerous. And that's why independent transcription matters. So Warren may have a legitimate criticism here. If there is no established chain of custody for the transcript, if there is no independent verification, if the public is simply being handed a transcript and told that these are the words being spoken, then skepticism is justified. But again, there is a line. You can say the transcript is unverified. You can say the audio is ambiguous. You can say the processed version has authentication concerns. What you cannot automatically do is jump from unverified to fabricated. That leap requires evidence of its own, and that's the pattern we need to watch throughout this interview. There are legitimate points. And then there are moments where a legitimate point is pushed one step further than the evidence can comfortably support. That extra step is where the controversy begins. Then we come to perhaps one of the most consequential claims in the entire interview, the eyewitness timeline. According to the account presented by Ed Pollack, two people described as credible and longtime acquaintances of Nolan reportedly saw him alive at approximately 5:50 p.m. That would be roughly 90 minutes after the boys allegedly left the island at around 4:30. If that account is accurate, it matters a lot because it potentially changes the timeline. And the timeline is everything in an investigation like this. If Nolan was independently seen alive and functioning normally well after the friend group had left, then any theory requiring something to have happened to him on that boat before it departed faces a major problem. That would be significant. But there is another word we have to use here: reportedly. Because the public is not being shown the witnesses themselves. Their names have not been disclosed in the interview. We are receiving the information through an attorney, and the attorney is describing them as highly credible. That doesn't mean the witnesses are unreliable. It doesn't mean the account is false. It doesn't mean the attorney is misleading anyone. It simply means that, at this stage, the public has not independently tested the claim. That's an important distinction. If those witnesses eventually speak to investigators, if their accounts appear in official records, if their identities and timelines can be independently corroborated, then this could become a genuinely important development in understanding Nolan's final known movements. But until then, it remains an assertion, a potentially important one, but still an assertion. And that's where the interview creates an interesting contradiction in its own messaging. The central theme is evidence, facts, verification, no speculation, no unsupported accusations. That is a reasonable standard. It's a good standard, but that same standard has to apply when the information helps your side. If someone says, "We deal in facts and evidence," and then presents an unnamed eyewitness account as effectively settled without giving the public a way to independently verify it, there is a tension. Not necessarily a lie, not necessarily a contradiction that destroys the claim, but a tension. And it's worth noticing, because credibility isn't established by saying you value evidence. It's established by allowing your evidence to survive scrutiny. Then the interview takes another turn. The legal threats, the defamation discussion. And this is where the language becomes much more aggressive. The position presented is absolute confidence in the innocence of the young men. Zero wrongdoing, no reasonable doubt, and strong warnings to people who have allegedly spread false claims about them online. As advocacy, that makes sense. A lawyer defending clients who are being publicly accused of serious crimes is going to push back. If people are making false factual allegations that these men participated in Nolan's death, those allegations could potentially cause enormous harm. Threats, harassment, public confrontations, damage to reputations. And, according to the interview, family members have experienced some of these consequences. That part should not be minimized. You do not have to believe every legal argument in the interview to recognize that harassment is real. You don't have to decide who caused Nolan's death to acknowledge that people who have not been charged with a crime should not automatically be treated as guilty. But defamation law is not simply a weapon that makes criticism illegal. There is a legal distinction between an opinion, a suspicion, a theory, and a false factual assertion. That distinction matters enormously. Someone saying, "I think they knew more than they have told investigators," is not automatically the same as someone saying, "They murdered Nolan Wells." Those are legally and factually different statements. The exact circumstances matter. The wording matters. The context matters. The evidence supporting the statement matters. And whether the statement can be proven false matters. So when an attorney publicly says that anyone who sues his clients will lose and pay attorney's fees, that's advocacy. It is not a guarantee. Courts decide individual claims based on their individual facts. And that is another place where absolute language deserves caution. Because there is an irony here. This entire series has repeatedly examined the danger of people speaking with absolute certainty. This is what happened. We know who did it. This proves everything. Those statements can sound powerful. They can sound authoritative. They can even sound comforting. But certainty is not evidence. And that rule doesn't change depending on who is speaking. Not when it's a YouTuber. Not when it's an attorney. Not when it's a family member. Not when it's a commentator. Not when it's an investigator speaking publicly. And not when it's someone defending themselves. The standard has to be the same. There is also the racial component raised in the interview. This deserves careful handling. The argument presented is that racism and profit-driven outrage may contribute to some of the speculation surrounding the case. That is not an impossible theory. Online outrage generates attention. Attention generates engagement. Engagement can generate revenue. And sensational claims can travel much faster than careful ones. That is not unique to this case. It is part of the broader online media environment. But there is another side to the issue. Concerns about racial dynamics in the way cases are investigated and covered can also be sincere. They cannot simply be dismissed as somebody chasing money. And that is where the argument becomes complicated. Because you can recognize that some people exploit racial tension for clicks, while also recognizing that genuine racial concerns exist. Both things can be true. The danger comes when somebody takes a broad pattern and applies it automatically to an individual. Saying outrage can be profitable is one thing. Saying a particular person is motivated by profit is another. The first is a general observation. The second is a claim about someone's internal motivation, and unless there is evidence for that individual motive, certainty becomes speculation. That is another example of the same problem running through this interview. A reasonable observation gets converted into a definitive conclusion, and the stronger the language becomes, the more evidence is required to justify it. But underneath all of the legal arguments, there is something much more human. 3 young men who have not been charged with a crime are dealing with serious public attention. The interview describes harassment, threats, confrontations, family members allegedly being approached in public. That matters. And it matters regardless of what the eventual investigation concludes. If someone is innocent, those consequences are devastating. If someone eventually turns out to have information investigators needed, that still doesn't mean random members of the public were justified in threatening them. Those are separate questions, and separating them is important. Now step back. Look at the interview as a whole, because when you do that, something becomes obvious. The friend group side is finally presenting its own version of events in a sustained, organized way. And it is doing so through a sympathetic platform. That matters. Not because a sympathetic platform automatically makes the information false, but because every public statement has a purpose. This interview is not a courtroom. It isn't an evidence locker. It isn't a police report. It is advocacy. It is designed to persuade. And persuasion has its own psychology. You select the strongest facts. You emphasize the strongest arguments. You attack the weaknesses in the opposing narrative. You present your clients as human beings. You describe the consequences they are experiencing. And you establish a moral framework where your side becomes the side demanding fairness and the opposing side becomes the side spreading harm. That is how public persuasion works. And interestingly, the same communication strategy has appeared throughout this case from multiple directions. Different people, different theories, different interests, but remarkably similar tactics: confidence, emotion, certainty, an appeal to the audience, a claim that the other side is being dishonest or irresponsible, a presentation designed to make the audience feel that one interpretation is obviously correct. That doesn't mean every side is equally credible. It doesn't mean every argument is equally strong. It simply means we should recognize the architecture of persuasion when we see it. Because once you recognize the technique, you can separate the presentation from the evidence. And that is exactly what we need to do here. Ask yourself a simple question. If you removed every confident statement from this interview, what evidence would remain? That's the test. Not who sounded more convincing, not who appeared more sincere, not who spoke with greater authority. What remains when the rhetoric is removed? GPS data. If independently verified, that's evidence. Official records? Evidence. Forensic analysis? Evidence. A documented timeline? Evidence. Video that can be independently reviewed? Evidence. An authenticated recording? Evidence. A named witness whose account can be tested? Evidence. But an attorney saying two unnamed people are extremely credible? That's testimony. It can become evidence. But it still needs verification. A commentator saying the audio was fabricated? That's an assertion. It requires proof. A commentator saying the audio is definitely Nolan? Also an assertion. It requires proof. And that's the distinction that keeps getting lost. The most reliable evidence is usually the evidence that doesn't care whether you believe it. A GPS record doesn't care about the argument. A forensic finding doesn't care who has the better public relations strategy. An official report doesn't become more accurate because somebody delivers it with confidence. That is why independent evidence matters so much. Because people have incentives. People have loyalties. People have reputations to protect. People have clients to defend. People have audiences to satisfy. People have money to make. People have families to protect. People have anger. People have grief. People have fear. And all of those things can influence the way information is presented. That doesn't mean everyone is lying. It means we should understand the difference between testimony and independently verified evidence. And that brings us back to Nolan. Because despite everything said in this interview, we still don't have the final answer. The circumstances surrounding his death remain unresolved in the way that matters most. His actual cause of death has not been publicly established in a way that settles every disputed theory. And the timeline still contains questions. The audio remains disputed. The eyewitness claim remains something that needs verification. The Coast Guard call provides meaningful evidence against one narrow theory. The footage may provide additional information about behavior during the emergency. But none of these pieces, individually or collectively as presented here, gives us permission to replace uncertainty with certainty. And perhaps that's the hardest conclusion to accept. Because people hate uncertainty, especially in a case involving a death. We want a villain. We want an explanation. We want a moment where everything suddenly makes sense. But investigations don't always work that way. Sometimes the honest answer is, we don't know yet. And saying that isn't weakness. It is discipline. So where does that leave this interview? It leaves us with something much more complicated than either side would probably prefer. There are legitimate arguments here. The Coast Guard call is one. The behavioral argument surrounding voluntary contact with authorities deserves consideration. The concerns about the authenticity and chain of custody surrounding the processed audio deserve scrutiny. The possibility that viewers can be influenced by a transcript before hearing ambiguous audio is absolutely worth understanding. The reported 5:50 p.m. eyewitness account could become extremely important if independently verified. And the reports of harassment against people who have not been charged with a crime deserve to be taken seriously. Those are not trivial points, but there are also claims that go beyond what the evidence currently establishes. Calling disputed audio fabricated requires more than demonstrating that a processed version cannot be authenticated. Calling an unnamed witness account definitive requires more than an attorney's confidence in that witness. Predicting that every potential defamation lawsuit will fail is advocacy, not a judicial ruling. And attributing individual motives such as profit or racism requires evidence specific to those individuals. Those are the places where caution is necessary. Not because the people making the claims are automatically wrong, because the evidence has to be allowed to speak for itself. And perhaps the biggest lesson from this entire interview is actually very simple. Every side in this case wants you to believe them. Every side has a story. Every side has facts they believe are important. Every side has evidence they believe proves their position. And every side has reasons why the other side should not be trusted. But the truth doesn't become more true because someone explains it better. It doesn't become less true because someone attacks the person presenting it. The truth has to survive independent verification. That's the standard. So when you hear someone say, "We know," stop for a second. Ask, "How do you know?" When someone says, "This proves it," ask, "What exactly does it prove?" When someone says, "They couldn't possibly have done that," ask, "What evidence eliminates the other possibilities?" And when someone says, "These witnesses are completely credible," ask, "Who are they? What did they actually see? When did they see it? Can the account be independently confirmed?" Those questions aren't attacks. They're the foundation of a serious investigation. Because Nolan's death deserves something better than another battle of personalities. It deserves evidence, not viral certainty, not manufactured outrage, not internet detectives competing to produce the most dramatic theory. Evidence. And if the evidence eventually proves that these young men had absolutely nothing to do with what happened, then that should be accepted. If the evidence eventually reveals something different, that should also be accepted. The answer cannot be decided in advance simply because one side gave the better interview. And that's why this interview is important. Not necessarily because it solved the case. It didn't. Not because every claim made inside it should be accepted. They shouldn't. It is important because it gives us a clearer look at how the people defending the young men are framing the evidence. And once you understand that framework, you can test it. The strongest parts survive, the weaker parts become visible, and the unsupported certainty can be separated from the claims that genuinely deserve attention. That's what an investigation should do. There is one final point worth making. Real human suffering does not require us to abandon skepticism. You can feel sympathy for Nolan's family. You can feel sympathy for the young men facing harassment. You can recognize the pain on both sides. And you can still say, "Show me the evidence." Those positions are not contradictory. In fact, they are compatible. Because demanding evidence isn't the absence of compassion. It is how we protect everyone from the consequences of getting the story wrong. This case has now been shaped by weeks of interviews, commentary, accusations, legal arguments, forensic disputes, competing timelines, and public pressure. And every new statement adds another layer. But underneath all of those layers is the same unanswered question. What actually happened to Nolan Wells? We still need that answer. And until the evidence provides it, we should be very careful about pretending we already have it. Because the most dangerous thing in a case like this isn't uncertainty. It's false certainty. The moment we decide we already know what happened, we stop looking. We stop questioning. We stop testing. And that's when the real truth can become harder to find. So, take this interview for what it is. A serious defense of three young men. A powerful account of the harassment they say they have experienced. a collection of arguments that range from genuinely persuasive to highly debatable. Some claims deserve credit. Some deserve skepticism. Some deserve independent verification. And some should simply not be treated as established fact until the evidence catches up with the certainty. That is the standard, and it has to apply to everyone. The attorneys, the family, the commentators, the witnesses, the investigators, and us. Because in the end, we don't need the most convincing story. We need the story that survives the evidence. And until that evidence is complete, the honest answer is still the hardest one to say. We don't know yet. If you want us to keep following the evidence, separating the verified facts from the claims, and breaking down what changes as this investigation develops, subscribe to Crime and Order. Because when the story gets louder, we slow it down, and we look at what can actually be proven. I'm not asking you to choose a side. I'm asking you to keep asking questions. This is Crime and Order.